What happens when an emperor stops playing by Rome's rules, stops dressing like a man, starts calling himself a bride, starts marrying gods? Elagabalus didn't rule the empire. He rewrote it. He forced the Senate to bow to a black stone. He made generals kiss his husband's hand. He asked surgeons to remake his body. Rome wanted war. He gave them beauty. Rome wanted order. He gave them desire, and for that, they killed him. But you can't bury a story like this, not when it still haunts the empire's bones. He came from the east, wrapped in silk and mystery. His name was Varius Abatus Bassianus, but the world would not remember him that way. The name that history would whisper, sometimes in disgust, sometimes in awe, was Elagabalus. He wasn't born to rule, not at first. He wasn't raised in the golden halls of Rome or taught the lessons of emperors. He was born in Emesa, a small Syrian city drenched in desert sun, where the air smelled of incense and ancient gods still held sway. And from the moment he could walk, he was wrapped in the robes of a god, because before he ruled Rome, Elagabalus ruled the temple. His family were priests, guardians of a strange foreign deity known as Elagabal, a sun god worshipped with blood, drums, and fire. And the boy, he was named after the god himself. He wasn't just a child, he was the living vessel of a foreign god, and that god had plans for Rome. Elagabalus was no ordinary boy. While Roman children were taught to fight, command, and conquer, Elagabalus was taught to dance, to chant, to bleed for his god. At just 14, he stood before crowds in Emesa, dressed in gold and purple, his face painted with sacred oils. He lifted his hands to the sky, his body moving with the rhythm of drums, leading ceremonies older than Rome itself. People didn't look at him like a boy. They looked at him like a divine creature. And that's what he became. He believed it, lived it. He wasn't human. He was something else. But behind him stood a woman with far more earthly goals. Julia Mesa, his grandmother. She was the true architect, a political spider, a Roman noblewoman exiled to the east when her family fell from power. Her sister had once been empress, and she had tasted the life of the palace. She wanted it back. When the emperor Caracalla died, Rome fell into chaos. The throne was weak. A new ruler, Macrinus, sat unsteady on it, a man with no noble blood. Julia saw her chance. She looked at her strange, beautiful grandson, barely a teenager, and whispered into his ear. "You are not just a god," she told him. "You are an emperor." And Rome was ready for a new god. It began with rumors, coins minted in Elagabalus's name, letters sent to distant generals, whispers that the true heir of Caracalla was alive, that he walked among them, guided by the sun. The army was tired of Macrinus. He was a soldier, not a Caesar. He had no bloodline, no charm. And Elagabalus, with his soft voice and painted lips, was the opposite of what they knew. And that made him fascinating. The soldiers didn't understand his god. They didn't understand his makeup or his robes. But Julia paid well, and gold speaks louder than prayers. In the year 218 AD, the boy god marched toward Rome. Macrinus tried to stop him. He failed. The emperor was defeated in battle. His head was cut off and presented to the 14-year-old priest in a silk tent filled with incense. Elagabalus didn't flinch. He accepted the empire like it was always his. And the boy from Emesa, the one raised to worship the sun, now wore the crown of the world. But Rome was not ready for him. From the moment he entered the city, nothing felt right. He refused to dress like a Roman emperor. He wore flowing gowns, jewels, perfumed wigs, and golden slippers. He walked with a slow, delicate grace, flanked by eunuchs and dancers, his voice soft and melodic. He ordered statues of Jupiter, Rome's king of gods, to be taken down and replaced with black stone images of Elagabal. He didn't bow to Rome's gods. He made Rome bow to his. And then there were the rumors, whispers that the emperor visited brothels at night, not in disguise, but proudly, dressed in woman's robes, offering himself to strangers. That he sold his body in taverns and inns, not for money but for desire, for humiliation. That he turned the palace into a house of mirrors and silk sheets, filled with music and moans and prayers to the sun, that he called himself empress, that he begged physicians to turn him into a woman, to cut, to shape, to transform, that he wanted a womb, that he asked surgeons if it was possible to be reborn. Was it madness or freedom? Rome couldn't decide. The Senate was horrified, the generals whispered. But Elagabalus didn't care. He didn't live by Roman law, he lived by the sun. And in the name of his God, he changed everything. He built a new temple, a massive structure higher than any altar in Rome, dedicated not to Jupiter, not to Mars, but to Elagabalus. He paraded the stone image of the sun god through the streets in a golden chariot, dragging senators behind like animals. He married women. He married men. He married a charioteer, a slave, a priest, and called each of them his husband. He gave them rings. He gave them titles. He called them queens. And the people were confused. Some laughed. Some cried. Some prayed for lightning to strike the palace. But no one dared stop him, because behind the perfumes and silks, Elagabalus still had legions, still had generals, still had Julia Mesa, pulling strings in the dark, for now. But the boy from Emesa, the godchild turned emperor, had only just begun, and while Rome turned its head in disgust, Elagabalus turned to the sun and smiled. Rome had seen emperors born in war. It had seen rulers with scars, with swords, with fire in their blood. But now, Rome had an empress, and not just any empress. Elagabalus sat on the throne, wearing golden earrings, flowing silks, and perfume strong enough to choke a soldier. He didn't walk like an emperor. He swayed. He didn't command with shouts. He whispered. He didn't want to be obeyed. He wanted to be worshipped. He didn't see himself as a man. He didn't see himself as a ruler. He saw himself as a bride, chosen by the gods to bring heaven and earth together, and Rome was expected to fall in love. When Elagabalus arrived in the capital, the people gathered by the thousands. They expected a young Caesar. They got a painted priest. He stepped out of the imperial carriage in a robe of gold thread. His face was powdered, his eyes outlined in black. His voice was soft, nearly feminine. He bowed to the crowd, then turned away. He had no interest in pleasing them. One of his first acts was to marry a noblewoman named Julia Palla. It was a traditional Roman marriage, ceremonies, wine, public vows. But it didn't last. Within a year, she was gone, quietly divorced, her name stripped from all records. Elagabalus said she didn't excite him. He said he needed someone divine. Then came the virgin priestess of Vesta, a woman sworn to remain pure by Roman law. Elagabalus took her as his bride. The people were horrified. This wasn't just scandal, it was blasphemy. The punishment for a Vestal breaking her vow was death, being buried alive. But Elagabalus didn't care. He was above Roman gods. He was a god, or so he said. But then things grew stranger, because behind palace walls, Rome's new emperor no longer called himself husband. He called himself wife. He dressed as a bride. He covered his face with a veil. He demanded to be called lady, queen, mistress. He would often stand in front of a mirror and say, "Call me empress," and those who didn't disappeared. His nights were filled with games the Roman elite didn't understand. He held banquets where guests were served by naked dancers painted in gold. He brought eunuchs into high office. He appointed exotic lovers to positions of power. One man, a charioteer named Heracles, became his favorite. Elagabalus declared him husband in private and sometimes in public. He called him husband even while sitting on the imperial throne. He would kiss him before the Senate, hold his hand during trials. He built him a palace, gave him titles, even passed laws to protect him from insult. The emperor had become a bride, and the empire? It began to look more like a stage than a state. Behind closed doors, Elagabalus asked doctors the impossible. He asked for a surgery. He offered them gold. All he wanted was a womb. He begged for someone to make him into a woman, to change his body to match the spirit he said lived inside. Of course, Rome didn't have the tools, not then, but the asking was enough to shock the court. He didn't want to rule as a man. He didn't want to rule at all. He wanted to live as a wife, a queen, a goddess. And the palace became his temple. He painted the walls with stars, covered ceilings in gold leaf, filled fountains with wine. He brought musicians from Syria, priests from Egypt, dancers from Persia. They played songs no Roman had heard before. They danced in ways Romans didn't understand. And in the middle of it all was Elagabalus, smiling, drunk, wrapped in silk, offering roses to men and women alike. But not everyone smiled back. The Senate watched with growing anger. The generals gritted their teeth. Even the people who once laughed at his wild parties began to worry. Not just because of what he did, but because of what he might do next. Because Rome had seen cruel emperors, it had seen madmen, but never one who erased every line between man and woman, king and queen, priest and bride. Elagabalus wasn't just changing the empire, he was unmaking it. Then came the temple. In the heart of Rome, he built a massive altar to his god, the black stone of Emesa, brought all the way from Syria. He declared Elagabal, the Syrian sun god, the true ruler of the Roman world. He forced senators to attend rituals. He brought sacred Roman relics, like the shield of Mars, and placed them at the foot of his god. He said all other gods were lesser. Even Jupiter, king of the Roman heavens, must now bow. And when priests objected, he had them whipped, or killed, or simply erased. Because Elagabalus didn't argue. He commanded, but behind the perfume, behind the gold and makeup and silks, the empire began to crack. The military lost faith. The Senate began to whisper. And even Julia Mesa, the grandmother who had helped him rise, began to regret what she'd done. Elagabalus was no longer a boy god. He was a threat. And Rome was preparing a replacement. But Elagabalus didn't notice, or didn't care. He was too busy picking out dresses, dyeing his hair, writing love letters to men who would never return them. He saw the empire not as a burden, but as a costume, something to wear, to play with, to decorate. He didn't want to rule Rome. He wanted to reimagine it, to turn the empire into a mirror of his dreams. But dreams, when they go too far, become nightmares. And the empress on the throne was about to learn how fast Rome can fall out of love. Elagabalus had already shocked Rome. He had worn the robes of a bride. He had kissed his male lovers in front of the Senate. He had begged doctors to give him a womb. But that was just the beginning, because now he wanted to marry a god, not metaphorically, not symbolically, a real divine union between himself and his god, Elagabal. The black stone from Syria, sacred, ancient, and for Elagabalus, alive. To him, it wasn't just a rock. It was the sun itself, a god of light and fire. And Elagabalus believed that God had chosen him to be its bride. The ceremony was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. The emperor wore a veil of golden thread. He walked slowly, barefoot, through the temple courtyard. Dancers from the east threw petals at his feet. Flutes and drums played strange, haunting rhythms. The priests of Elagabal burned incense so thick it choked the air. And in the center of it all was the stone, shining under the sunlight, placed on a golden chariot like a king on a throne. Elagabalus stood before it. He bowed. He offered wine, honey, and the blood of sacrificed animals. Then he lifted his arms and declared, "This is my husband. I am his bride. We are now one." And the people of Rome, who watched in the stunned silence, realized something terrifying. Their emperor hadn't just married a god. He believed he was divine. From that day forward, Elagabalus ruled as both emperor and high priest. He renamed himself the faithful wife of the sun. He declared his god above Jupiter, above Mars, above all Roman deities. He said that all gods must bow to Elagabal, and Rome must follow. Temples to Jupiter were closed. Statues of Roman gods were removed or hidden. New altars were built, grand, golden, eastern. And the rituals? They were unlike anything Rome had ever known. He made senators attend his Syrian festivals. He forced the elite to wear robes of silk and chan in languages they didn't understand. He danced through the temple grounds in embroidered slippers, trailing perfumes behind him. Sometimes he would dress as Venus, goddess of love, and sit beside the black stone as if posing for a divine wedding portrait. He made love offerings by night, held processions by day. He sacrificed bulls, birds, and sometimes even people, claiming it was the will of the god. The priests whispered behind closed doors. The nobles stared with cold faces. The army began to grumble, but none dared speak, because Elagabalus wasn't just eccentric. He was emperor, and the emperor was now a god's wife. His behavior grew stranger with each passing week. He once ordered the sacred relics of Rome, the fire of Vesta, the shield of Mars, even the palladium of Troy, to be moved into the temple of Elagabalus. He said the gods of old were no longer needed, that Rome's soul had shifted, that only Elagabalus mattered now. He wanted the entire empire to worship the black stone, to kneel before it, to forget Jupiter, forget Rome's past, and enter a new Eastern age of light and passion. He didn't just demand obedience, he demanded transformation. But the people didn't transform. They resisted quietly. They whispered in the streets. They mocked the rituals in taverns. Soldiers rolled their eyes when summoned to the temple. They didn't want to chant. They didn't want to bow. They didn't understand why the emperor kissed the stone, why he called it husband, why he walked barefoot through blood, humming Eastern hymns while Rome's borders burned. And as the people grew restless, the empire itself began to shake. The army lost battles on the frontiers. Food became scarce. Gold was spent on jewels, not weapons. The Senate passed fewer laws, because Elagabalus no longer cared for policy. He cared for pageantry. Every week was another festival, another parade, another wedding ceremony. Sometimes he married male dancers. Sometimes he married his god again, renewing vows in elaborate shows with fireworks and flames. Rome no longer knew what day it was, because every day had become theater. And in the center of it all stood Elagabalus, painted, perfumed, smiling. But power built on performance doesn't last. The generals began to worry. So did his grandmother, Julia Maesa. She had placed Elagabalus on the throne, but now she saw what she had unleashed. Not a ruler, not a boy, but a storm, unpredictable, destructive, and divine only in his own mind. She began to meet secretly with the Praetorian Guard. She whispered about a cousin, a quiet boy named Severus Alexander, calm and obedient, a backup, a replacement, a shadow waiting to become the sun. And while Elagabalus danced in his silks, the knives were being sharpened. Still, he didn't see it, or refused to. He was too busy planning another union, this time between his god and the goddess Urania from Carthage. He said he would marry the two deities in a cosmic wedding, that the entire universe would celebrate. He built golden chariots for their statues. He threw pink petals from rooftops. He shouted prayers in languages no one understood. He said the gods were now joined, and so was Rome and the heavens. The city watched in silence, not with awe, but with exhaustion. The show had gone on too long, and behind the walls of the palace, Julia Maesa made her final decision. It was time to end the marriage, to break the bond, to silence the bride of the sun. Elagabalus woke each day thinking he was closer to godhood, but what he didn't know was this. The people had stopped watching, the army had stopped obeying, the Senate had stopped fearing, and once Rome stops fearing, Rome begins to act. Because love can fade, worship can turn to rage, and gods, even gods, can fall. Elagabalus thought he was untouchable. He had married his god. He had silenced the Senate. He had wrapped himself in silks, perfumes, jewels, and power. But beneath the gold, cracks had begun to form. Not just in the marble of his palace, but in the people, in the army, in the empire itself. Rome was tired, not of spectacle. They had seen plenty, not of pleasure. They indulged in their own, but of chaos, of confusion, of a boy king who thought he was a goddess, a god, and a priest all at once. They had clapped politely through his weddings. They had bowed during his sermons to the sun. They had watched him build temples, burn incense, and call himself the bride of eternity. But now, they were done. It started small. A few soldiers refused to attend his sunrise ceremonies. Then a few more skipped the evening processions. They said they had guard duties. They claimed illness. They avoided the golden palace where Elagabalus danced and prayed and whispered to his god stone in secret tongues. They were tired of watching their emperor wear makeup thicker than any empress. Tired of hearing foreign drums when Rome bled on its borders. Tired of pretending this was leadership. They wanted a Caesar, not a showgirl, and they weren't alone. Even Julia Maesa, his grandmother, had grown cold. She had once cheered him on, guided him, protected him. But now she saw what the empire saw. Not a leader, but a symbol of decay. She had placed him on the throne with one purpose: to preserve her family's rule. Now that throne was cracking under madness. And the more he draped himself in pearls and danced through the temple with boys in costume, the more Maesa feared he would bring down everything. So she made a plan. Quiet, patient, deadly. His cousin, Severus Alexander, was the perfect opposite. Calm, stoic, Roman. He didn't wear gold. He didn't worship stones. He didn't demand to be called a goddess or god. He was exactly what Rome wanted now. Order, not chaos. And Julia Maesa began to move her pieces into place. She gave Alexander guards of his own. She sent letters to generals in the provinces, painting him as the hope of Rome. She told the Senate that Alexander was being trained. Just in case. And all the while, Elagabalus danced in the dark, unaware the spotlight was moving away from him. But he felt something, a change in the air, applause that wasn't as loud, eyes that no longer shone with fear, whispers that followed him down palace halls. He grew nervous, paranoid. He stopped sleeping. He ordered his priests to sacrifice more animals, looking for omens in the blood. He summoned astrologers to read the stars. He asked his god if betrayal was coming, but the stone stayed silent. And so Elagabalus turned on his cousin. At first, he simply removed some of Alexander's guards. Then he summoned him to the temple, made him kneel before the god stone, and swear loyalty. He forced Alexander to call him divine spouse, made him drink sacred wine, made him wear a dress during the ceremony. But Alexander did not flinch. He obeyed, smiled, played the part, because he knew his time was coming. The final straw came with a simple command. Elagabalus told the Praetorian Guard that they were to transfer full authority back to him. Strip Alexander of his rank, his guards, his status. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply looked at one another, and then they made their choice. It happened in silence, in steel, in blood. The guards didn't arrest Elagabalus. They didn't exile him. They killed him, right there in the palace. Some say it was in the garden. Others say it was in the temple. The details change, but the end is always the same. They dragged him from his chamber. They beat him, stabbed him. His screams were said to echo through the golden halls, once filled with laughter and music. They killed his mother too, Julia Somias, who had raised him, defended him, fed his illusions. She died begging for mercy. None came. They didn't bury him. No tomb, no honor, no final rites. Instead, they beheaded him, stripped his body, dragged it through the streets of Rome like garbage. They tossed it into the Tiber River, a body once worshipped as divine, now bloated and broken, floating in filth. And just like that, the sun set on the bride of the sun god. But the empire didn't cheer. There was no victory parade, no festival, just relief. A heavy, exhausted kind of silence, as if the city itself exhaled for the first time in years. The temples were reopened. The Eastern priests were banished. The sacred relics were returned to their rightful altars. Statues of Elagabalus were shattered. His name was erased from stone. His laws were burned, and yet his memory remained. Because Rome could not forget what it had seen. An emperor in heels, a priest who married a stone, a boy who asked doctors to turn him into a woman. Not in secret, but with golden ceremony. He had turned his body into a stage, his palace into a brothel, his reign into a performance of decadence and desire. And though he ruled for only 4 years, he left a shadow longer than emperors who ruled for decades. Some whispered that his ghost haunted the gardens of the Palatine Hill, that his laughter echoed in the wind, that his reflection appeared in moonlit fountains. Others said he had been a warning from the gods, a lesson in what happens when power and delusion become one, when the crown becomes a costume, when worship becomes self-love. He was not remembered with statues. He was remembered with fear, a name said in low tones, a reign written in red ink. Elagabalus had wanted to be eternal, to be a goddess, a god, a legend. And in a way, he succeeded, not through temples, not through love, but through the sheer strangeness of his story, the boldness of his desire, the chaos he left behind. Because history forgets the ordinary, but it never forgets the extraordinary, even when it wishes it could. Elagabalus was dead, drowned in the Tiber, beaten by his guards, forgotten by the state. But even as his body sank into the river's filth, something lingered. Not his power, not his beauty, not even his God, but something deeper, a ghost, a reflection, a question Rome couldn't shake. Who or what had they just destroyed? Was it an emperor, a heretic, a monster, or just a boy who wanted to be someone else? The Senate tried to wipe it all away. They passed law after law. They called his reign illegitimate. They forbade his name from being spoken. His images were torn down, painted over, shattered. Every coin with his face was melted. Every scroll rewritten to skip his years. Every record branded with the word damned, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It meant he never existed. But Rome wasn't convinced, because the people remembered. The soldiers remembered, and the mirrors remembered too. The stories didn't vanish. They multiplied. They twisted. They grew. One slave girl claimed she saw Elagabalus walking through the palace garden, robes trailing behind him, face pale as moonlight. A fisherman swore that his boat struck something soft in the Tiber, and when he looked down, he saw a figure staring back. Eyes open, lips moving, a song bubbling from the water. Children whispered that if you spoke his name in the dark, a breeze would carry perfume through the room. Sweet, rotten, familiar. The rumors grew darker. People said his spirit had infected Rome, that since his death, lovers fought more fiercely, that marriages fell apart, that women wept without reason, that men looked at their reflections and didn't recognize themselves. They blamed him for strange dreams, for the sickness of the soul, for everything soft that suddenly felt dangerous. He had blurred too many lines, between God and man, woman and man, emperor and courtesan, priest and performer. And once the lines were blurred, they never returned. Some philosophers argued he had broken nature itself, that his body had been a rebellion, that his life was proof of what happened when desire ruled over reason. They called him unnatural, unholy, a freak in gold robes. But others quietly disagreed. Not in public. That would be suicide. But in private gatherings over whispered wine, some called him brave. I think he simply wanted to be seen, one poet wrote, to be held without shame. He did not want to rule. He wanted to be known. They called it tragic. Not monstrous, not evil, tragic. The mirror he had left behind, the mirror that was his life, showed more than Rome wanted to see. It showed a world where emperors were gods but broken ones, where power made you a puppet, where gender bent under pressure, where the crown could be made of roses as easily as iron, and where identity could be a mask, or a truth too bright to bear. Elagabalus had lived without apology. That was his crime. He wore makeup in the Forum. He wore dresses in the Senate. He married not one woman but multiple men, and called himself their bride. He asked surgeons to remove his sex if possible. He paid gold for the chance to become something new, something divine, something free. Rome wasn't ready, maybe no empire ever is. In time, statues of him were dug up accidentally. Historians debated whether to call him he or she. Some called him the first transgender ruler. Others refused, but the arguments never stopped. Because Elagabalus made people uncomfortable, not just with what he did, but with what he showed. That identity is fragile. That power can be feminine. That worship can turn inward. That even a god can weep in the dark, longing to be someone else. His temple was torn down. The black stone of a mesa returned to Syria. The rituals abolished. The priests slaughtered or exiled. The flames extinguished. But Rome never truly erased him. They couldn't. because the ghost had slipped past the guards, into the streets, into the songs, into the broken places where memory hides. You could destroy a man, but not the idea of him. And Elagabalus had become an idea, wild, dangerous, intoxicating. He became a symbol of shame, of pride, of madness, of freedom, and of fear. New emperors came. They built walls, waged wars, issued coins with their clean-cut faces. They called themselves fathers of the people, defenders of tradition, restorers of Rome. But every so often, a soldier in the provinces would whisper, "At least Elagabalus gave us color." A merchant would joke, "He wore better robes than Jupiter." A young boy would try on his mother's jewelry and say, "I am divine," and the mirror would crack again, just slightly. Centuries passed. Elagabalus became myth, then metaphor, then mystery. Painters in the Renaissance rediscovered his story and painted him in velvet, surrounded by dying roses. Playwrights wrote him as both villain and victim. Modern writers didn't know what to do with him. Some said he was insane. Others said he was brave before his time. Some called him the first martyr of selfhood. Others said he was simply lost. But no one could look away. Because even now, 2,000 years later, his name still stings, still tempts, still asks, "Who are you? And who are you allowed to be?" Rome never answered. It built more statues, more rules, more stories. But the ghost in the mirror stayed, not just in the palaces, but in the people, in the places where dreams rub against reality, where the body becomes a question, where power becomes a performance, where longing becomes law. That's where Elagabalus lives, not in marble, not in scrolls, but in the silence that follows the question, would you have condemned him too? Before the blood, before the screams in the palace, before the knives in the marble hallway, there was the temple, a place of music, of incense, of trembling devotion, the temple of Elagabalus, god of the sun, god of the sky, god of heat, god of lust, a foreign god, a Syrian god, dragged to Rome by a boy in eyeliner and silk. Elagabalus didn't just worship his god, he was his god. That was the truth behind the robe, the crown, the madness. He didn't see himself as emperor. He saw himself as the living incarnation of the divine, a sun walking on two legs, a flame given human skin, a god who desired and was desired. The temple stood on the Palatine Hill, built with gold taken from wars he never fought, raised with columns stolen from other gods, carved with images that made old priests sick, flowers and flames, nude figures in twisted poses, suns with eyes, serpents coiled around altars. In its center stood the stone, a black meteorite, smooth, heavy, eternal. It had once fallen in Emesa, his homeland in Syria. Now it stood in the heart of Rome, a god from the east planted in the soil of the west, a symbol of everything Elagabalus was, alien, shining, unwelcome. The rituals were strange. They had no order, no scripture, just fire, flesh, and rhythm. Dancers spun until they collapsed. Priests sang in foreign tongues. Drums beat like a heartbeat, fast, faster. Sacrifices were made, not of bulls or sheep, but of silence, of tradition, of shame. The emperor entered in robes that shimmered like oil on water, sometimes in gold, sometimes in violet, sometimes in sheer fabric that left nothing to the imagination. His face painted, his eyes wide, his smile distant. He moved like a bride approaching the altar, because that's what he believed he was, the bride of the sun, the bride of the god within himself. He declared every god beneath Elagabalus, Jupiter, Mars, even Apollo, once the favorite of emperors. All were cast aside, their statues taken down, their temples closed, their priests insulted, mocked, exiled. The temple of Vesta, Rome's most sacred fire, was left to flicker and die. When the people gasped, he answered, "The sun burns hotter." He married his god in a ceremony that stunned the capital, draped in a veil, bathed in perfume. He walked the aisle to the altar. Kneeling before the black stone, he whispered vows no one could hear. Some say he kissed it, some say he wept, some say he bled for it, and when it was done, he stood, radiant, trembling, crowned in gold. The marriage of emperor and god was complete, but it didn't end there. Elagabalus wanted all of Rome to feel the same devotion, to kneel, to worship, to burn. He brought sacred prostitutes from Syria. He had eunuchs perform in the temple, painted in silver, mouths full of songs that sounded like spells. He ordered citizens to participate in rites they didn't understand. Women forced to dance, men forced to bow, priests forced to bless. Some obeyed out of fear, some out of curiosity, some because they had nowhere else to go. But no one came out unchanged. The temple swallowed who you were and spit out something new. Elagabalus declared the gods of old dead. He renamed the months. He rewrote the calendar. He declared every day a festival, not of harvest or war, but of the body, of desire, of surrender. He threw feasts in the temple garden. Nude slaves served food shaped like body parts. Wine poured from statues that wept blood. Flowers rained from ceilings until guests suffocated. He gave away fortunes to strangers, then whipped nobles who asked for favors. He burned sacred scrolls to warm his bath. He held orgies in the sanctuary, claiming it was prayer through pleasure. And every time someone protested, he simply smiled and said, "You do not understand divinity." Many believed he had lost his mind, but others saw something else. A man who had shattered every rule and stood unbroken. A body that refused to be defined by birth. A soul that didn't care for borders. Between man and woman, emperor and priest, Rome and the world. He did not want to rule, he wanted to dissolve, to become pure light, to disappear into his God. And he almost did. The sun rituals grew more extreme. He began to speak in riddles. He claimed to see visions, the gods arguing, cities burning, the stars bleeding. He locked himself in the temple for days, fasting, sweating, praying. When he emerged, he announced, "Rome will be reborn in fire." He built a new chariot for the black stone, drawn by white horses, covered in silk. He rode beside it, not as master, but as wife, through the forum, through the streets, while the people stood in silence, unsure whether to laugh or fall to their knees. The Senate panicked. The army whispered. The people prayed to older gods. But Elagabalus did not see fear. He saw conversion. Every blank face was a future worshiper. Every silence was a sacred pause before devotion. He believed the world was bending to him, but the world was sharpening its knives. Still, the temple remained his sanctuary. It was where he felt real, not on the throne, not in the courts, but under that meteorite, under the sky, painted with fire. There, in the glow of sunset, dressed in silk, smeared with ash, singing to a god no one else understood. He wasn't a scandal. He wasn't a boy pretending to be a bride. He wasn't an emperor spiraling into chaos. He was divine, at last. But temples cannot protect you from history, not when history wants revenge. And Elagabalus had made too many enemies. Men with swords, men with scrolls. Men with enough power to decide what parts of your story survive and what parts are buried. They came for him not long after. But that's a tale for another night. For now, the temple still stands in the memory, not in marble, but in fire, in perfume, in drums, in defiance. The temple of desire. A place where a boy tried to become a god and nearly succeeded. The sky over Rome was never quiet. It carried voices, prayers, screams, whispers. But above the temple of Elagabalus, it carried something stranger. Silence. Not the calm kind, the kind that weighs heavy on your chest. That makes people look over their shoulder. That makes soldiers tighten their grip on their swords. It was the silence before collapse. The emperor still sang to the sun, still painted his lips and lined his eyes, still walked the marble halls of the palace barefoot, draped in lace, followed by eunuchs, dancers, and guards who hated him. But outside those halls, the city was unraveling. Elagabalus didn't see it. Or maybe he didn't care. He was too busy dressing for the gods. The palace had changed. Once it had been a place of empire. Now it was a stage. Every room redesigned like a scene in a dream, walls draped in red silk, mirrors in the ceilings, perfume thick in the air, clinging to skin like smoke. Some halls were lit only by candlelight, others by burning incense bowls that never went out. He had a throne carved to look like flames. He didn't sit on it often. He preferred to lie on the floor, wrapped in velvet, whispering to the statues of Syrian gods that lined the room. He said they spoke back. His hair was curled daily by a team of slaves, his skin bathed in oils and milk. He wore gowns sewn with sapphires, emeralds, pearls, some stolen from Roman temples. He once wore nothing but a thin net of gold chains to a Senate banquet. He laughed as the old men looked down in horror. He kissed one of them on the cheek and said, "Are you afraid of beauty?" The next morning, the senator was gone. No explanation, no body, just silence. He no longer tried to hide his other self, the one that stirred beneath the emperor's crown. He called himself a woman in private, then in public. He told the palace staff to refer to him as lady. He painted his lips red, darkened his brows, and walked through the halls in women's sandals, his voice rising in pitch with every passing week. He asked doctors over and over if it was possible to turn a man into a woman. When they hesitated, he shouted. When they gave an answer he didn't like, he had them whipped. He promised a fortune to any physician who could perform the transformation. None succeeded. But still he searched. Still he hoped. Still he believed the gods would grant him the miracle the world denied. And when medicine failed, he created his own version of truth. He began calling himself the Bride of the Moon. He told the palace priests he had been chosen for rebirth. He began hosting ceremonies where he stood in the center of a circle of dancers, veiled, barefoot, crowned in flowers. He wore a girdle of white feathers and nothing else. He chanted prayers in the Syrian tongue. He burned herbs that made people dizzy, lightheaded, and willing. He danced until his knees gave out. And when he fell, he said he had touched the divine. He married multiple times. To women, yes, but also to men. One was a blonde slave he called my husband. Another, a charioteer named Heracles, he called my queen. He declared them royalty, gave them robes, guards, even their own thrones. He kissed them in public, held their hands as they walked through the streets, and anyone who laughed, anyone who blinked the wrong way, was removed. He didn't care who watched anymore. He wanted them to watch, to witness, to understand. He wasn't playing a part. He was becoming what he always believed he was. Not a man, not a boy, but a sacred woman. The people didn't know what to think. Some were horrified, others fascinated. Some whispered that it was madness. Others said it was power unlike anything Rome had seen. But everyone was afraid. Because Elagabalus didn't just change the rules. He erased them. He made his body a battleground, and he ruled from it with pride. He began appearing in court wearing bridal veils. When senators arrived, they found him in silk sheets, lounging on a golden couch, surrounded by musicians playing foreign songs. He asked them strange questions. Have you ever kissed the sun? Do your dreams bleed? Would you die for beauty? When they tried to answer, he waved them away. He didn't care about politics. He cared about transformation, about pleasure, about power made flesh. He once invited the city's wealthiest women to a banquet, then arrived dressed in their jewelry, every ring, every bracelet, every necklace. He told them he had borrowed their beauty and that he wore it better. They laughed nervously. He laughed louder, and the next morning their homes were searched, their sons drafted into distant wars, their names quietly scratched off guest lists. He called it justice, but the Senate called it war. They met in secret, old men with broken hands, nobles with bruised egos, generals tired of watching their army serve a goddess in pearls. They plotted, they waited. They chose their moment carefully, but not yet. Not while the emperor was still adored by the guards. Not while he still ruled with fire in his eyes. Not while the crowd still feared the gods he claimed as kin. Still, something was changing. Even his supporters began to hesitate. The soldiers saw less gold in their hands. The priests grumbled about blasphemy. The whispers grew louder. And Elagabalus, radiant, defiant, oblivious, kept dancing. He believed he was untouchable, chosen, sacred. But the gods had fallen before, and Rome had sharp knives. In the moonlight, he walked the temple alone, wearing nothing but silver anklets and a white veil. He whispered prayers to the meteorite. He asked for love, for transformation, for a new name, a new body, a new truth. But the stone was silent. The gods were watching. And Rome was preparing for the final act. The veils began to fall, not all at once, not with a crash, but slowly, softly, like petals rotting on marble. Elagabalus still wore white lace, still painted his lips, still greeted the Senate in silk robes. But the eyes around him had changed, no longer wide with awe, no longer half-blind with fear. Now they watched him with something colder, sharper, waiting. The guards who once praised him now muttered behind his back. The priests who bowed to the sun, God now hesitated before lighting the incense. The senators who once trembled now clenched their fists beneath the table, because the empire was breaking. The streets were dirty. The treasury was low. The army had grown restless. Their gold shrunk, their respect gone. The people were starving, while the palace feasted on roses and pearls. And in the middle of it all, the emperor danced, barefoot, fragrant, glowing like a bride on her wedding night. Elagabalus didn't see it, or refused to. He believed the gods were still with him. He believed his beauty would shield him. He believed love would save him. But love in Rome was a blade. Rumors spilled like blood in the alleys. That he wore only women's robes in the temple now. That he had appointed Heracles, the charioteer he called my queen, to the rank of Caesar. That he had converted the palace into a brothel once again, entertaining clients behind silken curtains while soldiers stood guard outside. That he still paid men to hurt him, in the way he believed a woman should suffer for love. That he had offered half the empire to any surgeon who could turn him fully into a woman. And most dangerous of all, that he had begun preparing to name himself Empress of Rome. The Senate didn't laugh. The army didn't wait. The people stopped praying. But the gods Elagabalus worshipped were not quiet. He still performed rituals in the dark, still danced in moonlight, his body slick with oil, still bled animals over fire and claimed to hear voices in the smoke. He said he had been reborn, that he was now one with the sun, that his spirit had merged with Elagabal, the Syrian god of light, that soon the world would see he was not just ruler of Rome, he was the bridge between heaven and flesh. But Rome had heard this story before. Nero sang his tragedies. Caligula married the moon. And both had ended the same way, cold, silent, broken. The Senate would not let it happen again. In the shadows, a new name began to rise. Severus Alexander, Elagabalus's young cousin, polite, clean, Roman. He didn't wear makeup. He didn't sing to stones. He didn't call himself a goddess. He was everything Elagabalus wasn't. And the army noticed. So did the Senate. And even some in the palace began to shift, ever so slightly, toward the boy. Elagabalus sensed it. He could feel the wind changing, the way doors took longer to open, the way servants avoided his gaze, the way Heracles wept alone in rooms once filled with music. He began lashing out. He ordered arrests, executions, purges. He accused his mother's advisors of treason. He beat his lovers in public. He wept on the floor of the temple, begging the gods to show him why they had gone quiet. But the gods answered with silence, and the knives in the city were being sharpened. One night he stood in his temple, dressed in full bridal garb, veil, jewels, sandals. He declared himself married to the sun. The crowd watched in stillness as he poured oil over his own head, chanting in a forgotten language. They said he danced until he collapsed, trembling and laughing. When he awoke, he whispered, "I have seen the next world. There is no death, only transformation." But Rome didn't want transformation. Rome wanted order, and it was preparing to take it back. The final blow didn't come with a scream. It came with a letter. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal to his throne, his perfume, his pearl, had made their decision. They demanded that Severus Alexander be made Caesar. They gave Elagabalus a choice: accept or face removal. His mother begged him to agree. She wept and held his hands, told him to bow, just this once. Elagabalus, eyes wild with betrayal, spat on the floor. He declared himself eternal. He told the guards they would burn in the sun's rage. He threatened to call down fire from the gods. But the gods didn't answer, and neither did the guards. The palace was quiet that night. Elagabalus walked through the halls, lighting candles. He wore a white robe, loose and flowing. His hair was undone. His hands shook. He sang an old Syrian hymn, soft and broken. Some say he visited the temple one last time, that he placed his hands on the black meteorite and whispered a goodbye, that he kissed the stone. Others say he spent the night with Heracles, speaking no words at all, just lying in silence until the candles melted away. At dawn, the guard arrived. No horns, no announcements, no fanfare, just armor, just blades, just death. They found him in the palace garden, seated beneath a fig tree. His mother was with him. So was Heracles. He stood to meet them. Head high, lips painted, veil trailing behind him. He said nothing. The guards surrounded him. One gave the order. The blades did the rest. They dragged the bodies through the streets. Elagabalus, his mother, his lover, torn, beaten, spat upon, thrown into the Tiber like garbage. His temples were stripped, his sacred meteorite shipped back to Syria, his paintings burned, his name struck from records. Rome tried to forget, but forgetting doesn't come easy. Even now his story lingers like smoke in a closed room. Some called him a monster, others a martyr. To some he was a warning. To others, a goddess crushed by gods who could not bear to see their reflection in his eyes. He ruled for just 4 years, but in those years he shattered every expectation. He challenged every law. He turned the greatest empire on earth into his stage. And in the end, he proved something terrible. That beauty, when wielded without mercy, becomes a weapon. That truth, when spoken too loudly, becomes dangerous. That identity, when declared with pride, becomes rebellion. And that Rome, despite its power, could still be shaken by a boy in a dress. Rome breathed again, not with joy, not with celebration, but with relief. The monster was gone, the boy in silk, the self-proclaimed goddess, the priest emperor of the foreign sun. They dragged his name through the mud just as they had his body. They spat it into the river. They scraped it off every wall. They buried his memory like a curse. But memory is never buried for long, especially not memories soaked in blood and perfume. The empire moved quickly to clean the mess. Temples were rededicated. The Syrian cult of Elagabalus was outlawed. The sacred black stone, once carried through the streets on golden chariots, was packed into a crate and quietly shipped back east. As if Rome had never bowed to it. As if Rome had never called it sacred. Statues of Elagabalus were smashed, but carefully, precisely. The face always first. The features, so soft, so painted, were hammered away. His eyes became empty holes. His mouth a jagged scar. It wasn't just destruction, it was punishment. Severus Alexander, his young cousin, was declared emperor. He was everything Elagabalus wasn't. Stoic, orderly, Roman. He restored the old gods. He praised the Senate. He declared a return to dignity. But even as Rome tried to return to normal, whispers still passed through the marble halls. Servants spoke of the veiled ghost in the garden, of footsteps in the temple at night, of the strange chill that clung to the walls of the palace, even in summer. Some swore the mirrors still showed his face, that his perfume still lingered in the air, that the gods, the real ones, had not yet left. Historians wrote carefully. Some skipped his reign entirely. Others called him a disgrace, a foreign puppet, a deviant, a demon. But between the lines, the truth burned. He was more than a scandal. He was a challenge, a mirror. He had dared to exist in ways Rome could not name. He had declared, without apology, I am not what you say I must be. And Rome could not forgive that. What frightened them most was not just his excess, his cruelty, or his rituals. It was his boldness, his femininity on a throne of swords, his refusal to hide, his laughter in the face of law. He didn't simply break Rome's rules. He danced on them. He bathed in them. He wore them like veils and tore them away with his smile. They said he prostituted himself in brothels. But worse, they said he enjoyed it. He embraced what others feared. He craved what others condemned. He asked to be cut open, transformed, made new. He called it divine. Rome called it madness. But underneath their outrage was fear, because if he could rule, dressed as a bride, surrounded by lovers and dancers and slaves, then maybe the whole foundation of Rome wasn't as solid as it seemed. He had turned the empire into a stage, not for war, not for conquest, but for identity. He was priest, lover, bride, goddess. He was Elagabalus, and for 4 years Rome had clapped, even as it trembled. Now they told themselves it had been a fever, a mistake, a foreign blight. They erased his name from coins, his image from stone. But even centuries later, the whispers lived, in dusty scrolls, in half-burned letters, in the corners of books where scribes dared to write what they really saw. Some remembered the horror, others remembered the beauty, because beneath the chaos, beneath the scandals and the blood, there was something else, something softer, something terrible, something true. A boy who wanted to be loved, a priest who saw the divine in himself, a ruler who believed worship and desire could be the same, and a heart, broken long before the crown ever touched his head. In Syria, stories still floated, that he had been born under strange stars, that fire danced in his crib, that he had seen visions before he could walk, that the sun had chosen him. Perhaps he believed it too deeply. Perhaps Rome never stood a chance. Modern minds still struggle with him. Some call him the first transgender ruler in history. Some call him a monster. Some call him misunderstood. He defies easy labels. He breaks language, just as he broke law. Because he wasn't just a man or a woman. He wasn't just Roman or Syrian. He was a storm in a silk robe, a question without an answer, a god who never waited for permission. He ruled for 4 years, 4 years of wine and blood, and beauty and fear. 4 years that shook the empire, and when it was over, Rome breathed again. But it never forgot, not truly, because stories like his don't die. They echo, they haunt, they burn. The ashes of the sun god settled into the cracks of the empire, and somewhere deep beneath the stones his voice still sings, not in Latin, not in Greek, but in the language of defiance, of desire, of divinity that doesn't need approval. And as long as empires fear difference, as long as power punishes truth, Elagabalus will never be fully erased. The curtains had fallen, the candles had burned down, the priest-emperor was dead. But Rome wasn't at peace, not really, because something had been unleashed. Not just scandal, not just shame, but a question too dangerous to ask aloud, too sacred for the temples, too raw for the Senate. What if he had been right? Elagabalus never returned, not in life, but in memory he stayed. He lingered in the silence after festivals, in the uneasy laughs of senators, in the tremble of a name whispered in shadows. No one spoke of him openly, but everyone remembered. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. Empires rose and fell. Languages changed, gods changed. But the stories survived, not as facts, not even as myths, but as warnings. In hushed voices, scholars still debated. Was he mad? Was he divine? Was he a threat or a mirror? They couldn't quite name what he was, because no word fit him. Not man, not woman, not emperor, not priest. He had moved between all of them, like silk through fingers. He had ruled by refusing to be ruled. He had defied the great machine of Rome, not with armies, but with a veil, with a gesture, with a kiss. Some said his ghost wandered the Palatine Hill, that his sandals still clicked against marble in the dark, that temple fires flickered when no one was near, that perfumes with no source drifted through the air, that statues once defaced slowly cracked again, as if trying to cry. They said he was punished, cursed, banished to wander. But others believed he had transcended, that no mortal could ever contain what he truly was, that Rome didn't kill him, it simply couldn't hold him. There's a quiet power in being remembered for the wrong reasons, for being feared, mocked, erased, because erasure is still attention. And Elagabalus? He was still here. Not in the Senate, not in marble, but in the things Rome never understood. He was there in every law that tried to define identity, in every whisper that feared softness, in every broken body punished for being different. The modern world, centuries later, would try to reassemble him. Historians flipped through ancient scrolls. They pieced together his life from gossip, letters, hatred, awe. They couldn't agree. Was he a villain? A queen? A rebel? A tragedy? They wrote biographies, essays, fiction, opera. Even in death he performed. One writer called him the first transgender monarch. Another called him a horror in silk. Still others refused to speak of him at all, because to speak of Elagabalus was to admit that power had once bent completely to someone who refused all categories, someone who ruled not with conquest, but with contradiction. Some things stood out in every story: his hunger for pleasure, his taste for gold, his cruelty, his laughter. But deeper, underneath the spectacle, was something softer, a need, a cry, an aching to be loved, not for power, but for truth, his own painful truth. He had begged his gods to make him whole. He had offered riches to any surgeon who could transform him. He dressed not for mockery, but for identity. He called himself a bride. He called his lovers husbands. He saw the sun not just as a god, but as a mirror. And every morning, when light hit his painted face, he believed for a moment that he was real. Rome told him he was wrong, that he couldn't be what he said he was. That power could dress in armor, but never in perfume. That strength wore sandals, not heels. That emperors conquered. They didn't cry, so he cried anyway. He conquered anyway. And when they killed him, he smiled, because he knew they would never forget. In some parts of the empire years later, people built shrines, not temples, not grand, but quiet, little alcoves, tiny altars, a statue with no name, a flame that never went out. Some lit candles to him not as a god, but as a ghost who understood, who had walked where others were not allowed, who had broken through the skin of empire and said, "This is who I am." He never got the surgery, he never got the words he needed, but in a way, he got something more. He got eternity, he got remembered, he got feared. And in the margins of every empire since, people like him whispered, "Elagabalus was one of us." Rome had thousands of emperors. Many ruled longer, many built more, many were worshipped. But only one turned the empire inside out. Only one turned the altar into a mirror. Only one burned so brightly that even 2,000 years later, the smoke still stings the eyes. So now you've heard the story. Not from the textbooks, not from the temples, but from the shadows, from the edges of history where truth doesn't need permission, from the stage that never closed, from the voice that was silenced, but never forgotten. If you feel disturbed, if you feel unsettled, good, because you've met Elagabalus, the emperor, the priest, the bride, the ghost, and you'll never forget him again. You've now walked through the darkest corridors of power. You've seen an emperor crowned in silk, drowned in scandal, and buried by silence. If Elagabalus disturbed you, unsettled you, or opened a door to a history you never knew existed, then don't stop here. Like the video, subscribe for more true stories that history tried to forget. Share this with someone who thinks emperors wore only crowns, not veils, because the past isn't always marble and glory. Sometimes it bleeds, and sometimes it wears a dress.